What's up guys, welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. In this video I'm going to be talking a little bit about European cards. So first off, just to give a demonstration of what I mean when I say that, I've got a couple of different LOB Blue Eyes White Dragons here. Now the one on the left is the regular North American version, which most people are familiar with. And if I show you the card code close up, you can see it says LOB 001. Whereas the one on the right, which you can probably see right away that the colors are a bit different between them. If I look at the same area, you can see that the card code is LOB E001. And the E, of course, stands for Europe. Now, there's already a lot of information out there on the internet, on social media, about these North American cards, and I feel like most collectors already know a lot about them. But in comparison, there's nowhere near as much information out there about European cards. And even a lot of the information that is out there is often inaccurate or misleading. So I grew up in Europe myself, meaning that I'm very familiar with the European versions. And I've also managed to gather a lot of information about them over the years from different people, different sources that I've come across. So I'm making this video, as well as my next few videos, about European Yu-Gi-Oh cards to help get a little better information out there, just about what they are and what there is to know about them. So the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game was launched in March 2002 by Upper Deck, to whom Konami had given the contract to run the TCG in North America. But whereas for America, they decided to play it safe and hire a different company to run the card game for them because they didn't have much experience of the Western market, in Europe, they decided that they would actually try and run it themselves. They didn't hire anyone else to take charge of it. So they used Europe as a kind of guinea pig to work out how they could eventually run the TCG in America as well, which is what they do now. But unfortunately, their attempts to run the TCG in Europe were a complete shambles, and it led to the release of LOB in Europe being delayed until right at the end of 2002, in December, which was over half a year after it had already come out in America. They hadn't even set up a printing facility in Europe by that point, so they actually had to get Upper Deck to print the cards in the USA, along with the North American cards they were making at the same time, and then ship them to Europe to be distributed. And I'll just show you now that the earliest European cards are the same as some North American cards. So what I have here is a first edition Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon European edition Trihorn Dragon, and a Summon Skull reverse foil from BPT. So these cards were actually produced at the same time in North America, and as a result, you should be able to see that they have extremely similar cardstock and colors, both on the front and on the back. Now it's interesting to note that it is specifically reverse foil BPT cards which match LOBE. The regular direction foil BPT cards actually have a different cardstock, and they're not the same as European cards. But these cards were produced together, and that's because Konami didn't originally have a facility in Europe where they could print the cards, so they had to get them printed in America and then ship them over. So these European Yu-Gi-Oh cards, which are printed on North American cardstock, are the earliest European edition cards, and they exist both for LOB and for the original two starter decks. So this is a first edition European Lord of D, and you can hopefully see it's made of the same stock as this Trihorn Dragon. Now these are also the only products released in Europe which have the square logo on the box. So you can tell you're buying one of these European LOB boxes rather than a later one, because A, it has the square logo on the front rather than the red logo writing, and also on the back it says printed in the USA, not printed in Europe. Now, Konami actually chose to run things pretty differently to how the TCG was run in North America, and probably the first and the most important difference between them is that in Europe, the boxes that were made had every single card in the set, and there was no hobby retail distinction like you see in America. So both this Trihorn Dragon and this Guy the Dragon Champion come from a box with the same card code. And even after Upper Deck took over a couple of years after the launch of the game in Europe, they still kept the same system, which means that even for GX boxes, for example, you can pull any Ultimate Rare from a European box, and there's no difference between hobby and retail. Another thing to note about the way Konami ran the game in Europe in the early years is that they were extremely relaxed about print schedules here. So, whereas in America they had released 4 different expansion sets by the end of 2002, and all sorts of different promotional products, tournament packs, things like that. In Europe, Konami had only released Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon, and they would not release Metal Raiders until halfway through 2003. So that made people over here pretty annoyed at how they were running the game, especially because even the one set which they did release, they cut out a lot of the most important cards. So there are 23 cards missing from the Legend of Blue Eyes European expansion compared to the American one, and those include Pot of Greed and Flame Swordsman, which meant that Pot of Greed was not legal in the TCG here until they put it into the Spell Ruler set the following year. So that whole situation meant that you had a lot of local stores here trying to import boxes from America, even though it was forbidden by Konami. And you had this kind of black market that emerged because everyone wanted the new sets which were coming out in America, and they weren't coming out in Europe. So the North American boxes became worth a lot more because you could essentially get them before release. But Konami did eventually get their act together, and in mid-2003 they opened up a new printing facility in Belgium, specifically to produce European cards with. So once that was up and running, the first thing they did was to reprint the first 3 things they had released, LOB, SDY, and SDK, so that they could restock all of the local stores around the country which were out of stock. And this was also when they released the first foreign cards. So French, German, and Italian versions of these cards were also made at the same time. So the new cards they made came after the logo change, which is how you can easily tell the difference for whether your LOB European box was made in North America or in Europe, because the North American ones have the square logo, and the ones made in Belgium, they say made in Belgium on the back, which is one way to tell, but they also have the red logo. And I'm just going to quickly do a comparison of the cards as well, because they are a bit different between the 2 runs. So this one on the left, this right arm of the Forbidden one, is on the North American cardstock, which is more or less dull. It doesn't have much going on the light. Whereas the second version that was made has a much more reflective, glossy surface. Now, you shouldn't confuse it with a glossy print card, because that's only referring to North American cards. But the surface is very reflective on these as well. And they also have much brighter colors, and I would say much higher quality printing. So if I bring them up close, the text is ever so slightly blurry on the one printed in America, whereas the European one has very clear font all over it. And the back is also a slightly different texture as well. It's less shiny on the Euro version. And I should just point out that along with these new glossier versions of the LOB cards that they printed at that time, they also made the first unlimited run of European cards. So the unlimited versions look pretty much identical to the first edition ones. They just don't have the first edition stamp, but they have the same cardstock and everything else. Now, in terms of the size of this second printing, it was definitely a lot smaller than the first one. So it's hard to say what the ratio is, but you definitely see a lot more of the cards which were produced on North American cardstock for first edition LOBE than you see of these ones with the glossier surface. And especially when you look at the sealed boxes, nearly all of the sealed boxes you will see out there have the square logo and not the red logo. I'm sure everyone is familiar by now with the fact that for the North American release of Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon, there were 2 different print runs. So there's wavy and glossy, as they're called. But for European cards, there are actually 3 different printings. So there's the one I showed you at the beginning, which was made in America. And there's the one I showed you just now, which was made in Europe. But what happened after they made that run is, first off, they switched to making the next set in the TCG, which was Metal Raiders. which came out in July of 2003, so about a year and a month after it was released in America. But after they had finished with this run, they actually made a third first edition printing of LOB, and I'll show you what's different about that now. So all of the cards I've showed you up to this point were made before Konami were forced to change the name of Magic cards to Spell cards due to a lawsuit with Magic the Gathering. So here's a first edition European polymerization. This one is the first printing of this card. Unfortunately, I don't have the second version of this card, which looks the same in terms of saying Magic card, but has the glossy cardstock rather than the dull one. But what I do have is the third and final first edition run of this card, and you should be able to see right away that it says Spell card on it. So apart from that, this printing is identical to the second glossy version, and as a result, you can only tell the difference for cards where they either say Magic card up here or they have it written in the description of the card, because those are the only ones which they changed for this print run to say Spell card. So this print is actually much rarer even than the second version that was made. It's really not easy to find European first edition cards which say Spell card on them. But yeah, so like I said, it only exists for cards which say Magic card somewhere in the text. For all the other cards, the third version is the same as the second one. So we're slowly getting closer to the end of the video now. But there's a few last things I thought I should mention to do with LOB specifically. So the first one, which I thought it was worth discussing, was the rarity of LOB E cards in comparison to the North American version. So there is no doubt that the European printing of LOB was a lot smaller than the North American one. Even when you add together all three print runs, there are substantially fewer cards printed in Europe than in America. And what's actually more important than that on this point is to do with the print quality of the cards. So it's always been the case with European cards. I don't know why, but throughout every era, they've had pretty significant issues with print quality. So with LOBE cards, there's a couple of different things. For the ones produced in Europe, the most common issue for them is to have whitening around the edges and corners right out the pack. And they also scratch extremely easily. So it makes getting them in gem mint condition very difficult. Most cards from the set are not higher than Population 1, Population 2 in PSA 10 or BGS 9.5. But what actually adds to the difficulty is that even though there was a run made in North America, which you would think is higher quality, in practice, the cards which were made in America for Europe have incredibly bad centering. So this is a pretty standard Guy the Dragon Champion European edition. And you can see that the left border is just nowhere. Almost the entire thing is on the right hand side. The back isn't actually as bad, it's still pretty shifted. But yeah, because of that, even the North American first print of European LOB cards is pretty difficult to grade. And as a result, it's very difficult to grade any kind of gem mint European card. Now, there isn't obviously a lot of demand for grading these things, but I guess that's a good thing, because if there were, you just wouldn't be able to grade them. And the final point to make about the cards themselves is that unlike North American cards, where for the first edition versions, every single card has the regular secret pattern, for European cards, for whatever reason, you can find both LOB and MRDE with reverse foils. So this is a Trident Dragon European edition with the normal foil. But this guy, the Dragon Champion, which I just showed you before, has the reverse top left to bottom right foil pattern. And I can also show you a Gate Guardian, which I actually pulled this exact card myself back in the day. You can see again, it's got the reverse secret pattern. So it's just interesting to note, because if you're only familiar with North American cards, it might seem pretty surprising at first that you see one with reverse foil that's European. And that brings us to the end of this video. So thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. And of course, if you have any questions about anything I said in this video, any suggestions for what I could do better or future content that you'd like to see, just put them down below in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to everybody. And stay tuned for the next video in this series when I will talk about the infamous Spell Ruler error set, which has received so much attention over the years, as well as the last couple of OG European sets that were released, and the handover from Konami to Upper Deck, which happened between 2003 and 2004. So thank you for watching everyone again, and I'll see you next time.